They fired me at 6:02 a.m. It was a polite kind of violence, clipped, corporate, practiced. Preston's voice on the line had that slimness of someone used to other people doing the dirty work for them. "You're difficult to manage," he said, as if he were delivering the weather. He didn't argue, didn't plead, didn't try the old "we need to talk about" fit, slow burn. He telegraphed, boxed the motion, and signed the envelope with the casual cruelty of a man who knew his father would clean up whatever leaked. I listened to him finish the sentence, like I was hearing a new song I already knew the words to. Morning light had edged into my apartment, the kitchen counter still warm from the pot I'd brewed before my phone buzzed. The coffee was thin and honest in the mug. I held it. It tasted like coffee tastes when you realize you're about to be asked to become a different person in someone else's story. "You don't have to tell me anything else," I said. My voice was small at first and then not. "Okay." The line clicked. The little digital clock on my stove blinked 6:03. On the table, my laptop hummed. My calendar had a box for Optimus investor call the next day at 9. 1,000 little entries that had been written by me and loved into being. Reminders, time zones mapped, the minor ceremonial gifts of corporate caregiving. I looked at the calendar like it was a wound map. They gave me a reason that would read well in any HR handbook: cultural fit. In Preston's mouth, it meant I pointed out problems instead of smiling at them. It meant that where he saw loyalty to lineage, I saw a failure to measure risk. Nepotism counts as corporate oxygen in a lot of families. It lets boys with silver spoons breathe resume oxygen they haven't earned. Difficult to manage is the phrase you hear when someone has to sentence competence to death because it refuses to kneel. In case you were wondering, yes, I thought about fury. For 37 seconds. Then the professional reflex I had honed for a dozen years kicked in. The one that lets you see outcomes instead of pain. Losing a job is a mess of emotions. Losing the narrative that you have built around your usefulness is a practical problem. You either stew or you plot. I haven't had time for stewing since grad school. Before they could flip the switches and make me a ghost on a spreadsheet, I had a window. The kind of windows you get in big companies. Procedural delays, automated revocation that takes a little while to propagate, calendar syncs that don't all collapse at once. In real life, people imagine those minutes as a cinematic chance to commit crimes or pull off heists. I will not give you that film. I will tell you what I did instead. I sat down. I cleared the countertop, set the mug down, and read the room. The entire room being the ecosystem of relationships I tended for years. What the corporate manuals never teach you is that client knowledge isn't just a file full of PDFs. Contracts are paper. Context is living. It's the whispered preference of an investor. The anecdote the CEO tells his wife at dinner that makes an investor lean in. The loyalty a junior associate builds by sending the overnight DAC when the time zone is wrong. Companies treat metadata like, well, metadata. People treat it like memory. I opened my laptop and watched the clock. 6:06. The access revocation hadn't landed yet. Whoever wrote the scripts for Optima's identity management had done a good job in most cases. In this one, there was a delay that bought me minutes. I could have used those minutes to wreck things. Delete files, scramble history, anything dramatic. I didn't. Not for ethical reasons, not because I was particularly saintly, but because sabotage is easy to see. Theatrical destruction fingerprints the arsonist. I wanted a correction that looked like market truth, not a vendetta staged to leave fingerprints. There are things an organization cannot easily calculate. Who gets calls when the whale needs feeding? Whose seat in the room reminds a trustee that the account manager remembers their daughter's name? Whose calendar entry makes a meeting happen because the right people think they'll be talking to the right person? Those are not in contracts. They are in people. I had lived in that invisible architecture for years. It was time to see what happens when you move the pillars without touching the beams. I called Marcus. Marcus Thorne was a regional director at Apex Capital, Optima's most obvious rival in our vertical, and had been a friend long before clients made him a name. We had a history of conversations that began with, "Do you remember when?" and ended in the sort of tradecraft that, in the industry, is known as knowing who knows whom. Marcus and I weren't conspirators. We were professionals who had built trust over lunches and product demos and times of crisis. He had a wedge, a tight fund that liked to follow strong managers into new vehicles. I had a wedge, intimate knowledge of who trusted me and why. At 7:30, with my access still nominally intact, I put the phone to my ear. The call was short, because I wanted it to be. I didn't narrate a manifesto. I said, "Marcus, I was just fired." He made a short inhalation, the sound of a man inserting the business version of sympathy. "Jesus, what happened?" "Preston. He fired me for being difficult to manage." He grimaced in the voice. Of course he did. I told him the practical parts, not how I would manipulate their calendar, not the minutes I had, but the fact of my dismissal and the truth that the ecosystem around Optima had no idea there was a reason to be worried. I told him the thing that mattered.
I could be persuaded to come over very quickly, with a title that would activate certain followers. I told him which investors usually took my calls and why. Names can be combustible. I use them sparingly.
At the end of the call, Marcus's voice went shady in the way men in suits get when they're considering whether to do something slightly delicious to a rival. "Give me till 8, he said. "If we can get you to Apex, I can put you in front of our institutional team by 10. If you want in, come down." I told him I'd be there if he made the offer simple and public enough to pressure Optimus back channels into showing their fractures. He agreed. We hung up. The clock had moved to 7:36. I made coffee while I dressed, a quick shower, hair in a neat knot that said, "I'm indifferent to your theatrics." I took a bagel on the walk to the train because old habits keep you human. Chloe texted me a small worried emoji at 7:51. Chloe was a junior analyst on my old team, the kind of woman who did the work no one bragged about and did it with a rigor that made you feel safe. She had been there the night I stayed late to comb through an audit, had held a spare umbrella during a torrential October, had texted me a picture of a sad sandwich when she was studying for her first CFA exam. She was the sort of collateral damage that made me keep my moral center, even while I planned subterfuge. "What did they say?" she asked. "I'm fine," I typed. "Take a breath. In the meantime, document everything you have, and lock your notes in your personal account. You can't move anything you don't own." She didn't press. My reply was a half-truth. Fine is what you tell someone so they stop pacing. Document everything is what you tell someone so they don't feel like they've been erased. I felt the small guilt like a pebble in my shoe, and decided to offer Chloe help if she needed a resume or an intro. Little people get bruised in big corrections. It's important to bring band-aids. By 9 a.m. I was in Marcus's car, the morning steel of the city sliding by, and Marcus kept his eyes on the road like a man conducting two businesses simultaneously. He had a taste for dramatic timing. Apparently Apex did too. His call with his team was brisk and efficient, and thereby effective. An offer, sharply worded, to bring me into a client-facing role with a title that would imply stewardship. They wanted me to be the face that said, "We are ready to protect your allocations." To be blunt, they were offering me leverage. Not a gun, not a hack, not theatrical sabotage. A job offer that, when shared in the right way, would look like a flight of capital towards competence, not only away from nepotism. Markets don't punish because someone told them to. They punish when confidence evaporates. Confidence evaporates when the person you thought you trusted can no longer make the system work, not because someone pressed a button, but because people stop believing in the hands at the wheel. I agreed, orally, without fanfare. Marcus promised a formal offer by 9:15 and said we would discuss messaging later. He dropped me at a cafe, where I sat very still and wrote the post I planned to make at 10. The words had to be exact, short, professional, and unaggressive. LinkedIn is a theater and a ledger. It remembers tone better than detail. I typed and retyped the post, tempering sarcasm into economy. Grateful for the opportunity to join a team that values client-first thinking, read a version. Excited to bring my client experience to a new role at Apex, another. I selected a sentence that implied forward motion without editorializing the past. I'll be joining Apex Capital to support institutional client relationships. No name-calling, no raising of flags. The goal was to create a vacuum, a polite, professional absence that the market could fill with its own anxieties. Before the post hit, though, I made a private move. Arthur Sterling. Sterling is hard to describe without reduction. He is called many things: a whale with a conscience, an investor who prefers to fund managers he feels understand language, not just numbers. He eats lunch at a certain place downtown and appreciates a steward who remembers his son's lacrosse team. In our industry, one man's reallocation can look like a ripple. Arthur was as much about ritual as about returns. He liked managers who took the time to know his preferences. I had spoken to him when I needed his patience on a product pivot. He had called back within 10 minutes the first time I'd reached out and said, "Dana, tell me what keeps you up at night." He trusts the directness of people who show their maps. At 9:22, I drafted a short message. No drama, no threats. "Arthur, quick note. I've been let go from Optima. I'm joining Apex shortly. Could we meet at the usual place at 12:30? I think you'll want to hear what this could mean." I didn't say they fired me for being difficult to manage. That would be delicious for a tweet, but the point wasn't to feel better. It was to ensure the right people were at the table when leverage shifted. A minute after I hit send, Optima sent their first move. Gerald, Optimus general counsel, who always wrote like he had been paid by the sentence, sent a terse email marked re-termination. It read like a legal posture, bluster about non-compete obligations and confidentiality, and warnings that someone should be careful about public statements. In the body, there was the kind of lawyerly threat designed to make people backwardly consider career suicide. I let it roll across my screen. The message did what it was supposed to. It distracted, it attempted to impose fear. Fear is currency. It buys hesitation. Hesitation keeps people in their lanes. My hesitation would have been the thing that sank me when I did not want to be sunk. I replied with a short acknowledgement. No defiance, no invitation to litigation. Thank you for the note. I will consult counsel. In the meantime, I intend to make a professional announcement at 10 a.m. I didn't say screw you, and I didn't say go to hell. Lawyers like to escalate. Sometimes they have nothing left but verbosity. At 9:58, Marcus called again. Everything's lined up on our side. August is good. He can be in front of Sterling this week. Good, I said. I have a lunch at 12:30. Sterling? Yes, perfect. He paused, the kind of pause that meant he was doing the math of optics. You sure you want to post now? You always ask the same question, I said. It depends whether you want to be chased for context or whether you want to make the market ask the questions. He laughed softly. You and your theatrics. It turns the tide faster, I said, and faster is clean. I put down the phone. The world outside the cafe window looked like an info commercial for confidence. Suits that assured it was Monday but meant business, joggers who were indifferent. I had a bagel and a black coffee. The bagel was underdone in the center, and I let its blandness remind me that the small discomforts are tolerable. At precisely 10 a.m., my LinkedIn post went live. It was a single line. Joining Apex Capital to support institutional client relationships. Grateful for the teams that taught me how to fight for the client. Dana. No drama. No adjectives that might be tweeted into a moral crusade. The idea was to make my movement a fact, an invitation to reallocate attention, not to inflame. Within minutes, the phone started to ring. Old clients texted, recruiters pinged. Someone forwarded the post to a group chat where Optima executives were already reacting. I kept my phone on vibrate because sounds are dramatic. I didn't need more theatrics. Arthur responded 2 minutes later with a single sentence. Meet me at 12:30. Bring yourself. The sentence was a bell. It was not an agreement, but it was as close as letters can be. And then the ripple started in earnest. The first was a voicemail at 10:06 from a junior partner at one of the funds Optima had been courting. She asked politely whether I could come on a quick call to clarify what the post meant for their exposure. I told her I'd be glad to talk, but referred her to the institutional desk at Apex once the offer was formalized in writing. She left feeling reassured. I had put a place in the world where their question would be answered by someone competent. The second ripple was a direct message to Preston from a trustee. A 3-line note. Is this true? Preston, who had the manners of someone who had never had to account to anyone but his father's timetable, waffled. He said something about internal reorgs, about retaining confidence, but his sentences lacked weight. The thing I had always noticed about Preston was that he performed leadership like a man reading a script he didn't understand. He had the right gestures, but not the gravity. Gravity matters. Optima's HR sent an all-hands email at 10:27 that read like a sermon crafted to soothe bleeding stock. We are making a leadership transition. It used the language of transformation, pivot, renewal, legacy. Those are words used to stretch meaning thin. On my end, my phone buzzed again. Chloe had sent a string of texts, questions about unemployment paperwork, about whether she should speak to anyone, about whether she would be okay. I wrote, pack your own narrative. I'll call you tonight. Take care. Then the predictable theater of legal posturing amped up. Gerald's next email, which landed at 10:49, had the legal equivalent of a spotlight attached, a threat to enforce non-compete clauses, and a reminder that confidential information is defined broadly. His tone suggested a man who enjoyed being the bad cop. I saved it and forwarded it to the corporate counsel at Apex in a way that was purely informational. Again, the point was not to create a courtroom drama. The point was to ensure that if anyone wanted to escalate, they would have to make good on the threat. What I did next was not dramatic, it was relational. I emailed the board members I'd worked with quietly, the independent directors who preferred directness to theater. My note was short. We're seeing a reshuffle that might affect stewardship. If you want a discreet update, I'm available. No protestations, no character attacks. It is stunning what a short clarifying note can do to undo the anxious spin a rumor creates. During all of this, Optima itself was throwing well-rehearsed shapes into the air, memos about retained talent, a press release promising continuity. Richard, Optima's CEO and Preston's father, called me at 11:04, his voice a mix of wounded patriarch and a man trying to figure out the plumbing of his collapsing brand. I could hear the paper thinness of his control. Dana, we can put this back together, he pleaded. We made a mistake. He did not apologize in the way that makes an apology redeeming. He apologized in the way men who control donations and press conferences apologize, by promising structural reforms that begin and end in language. I told him simply, I don't want the job back. That was true, and I wanted to make sure it was on record. Richard's reaction was theatrical. He moved from charm to bluster to panic in the space of 3 sentences. He threatened legal steps and then tried to cajole me by offering something I had already refused. It was the behavior of someone accustomed to people caving. He had never contingently thought about me as a person with leverage independent of his father's name. At noon, I walked by my building's lobby window and watched 2 men in Optima polos carrying a stack of boxes. Boxed desks are a visual that can sting. I smiled because the point of a smile is to remind yourself you are still in the narrative. I texted Chloe, lunch after you finish? We'll talk strategy. I went to lunch alone to clear my head, and instead found myself sizing the city in terms of optics. People who haven't been in those rooms imagine leverage as dramatic, documents, secrets, servers. It's not. Leverage is a chain of trust. If you can move a trust node, if the person who dines with Arthur Sterling signals they will steward funds elsewhere, then institutions begin to have to justify why their asset allocation shouldn't reorient. At 12:30, Arthur Sterling greeted me in a reserved corner booth. He wore a coat that had been tailored to suggest that he spent his life differently than the rest of us, which he had. He ordered Scotch neat for himself and black tea for me, which is the kind of small thing that reveals a lot about a man. The restaurant smelled of char and lemon oil. The world seemed more carefully constructed there. He looked at me like he'd expected half of my face and had gotten the whole. "You look calm," he said. "I'm allergic to drama," I replied. "It gives me breakouts." He laughed without amusement. "Tell me quickly." I told him the truth. I had been dismissed in a move that suggested the internal leadership preferred allegiance to blood over competence. I told him without theatricality that this created a material risk for any allocator because it meant decision-making on key accounts could be subject to nepotistic interference. I might have said it erodes the fiduciary if I wanted to play the field with jargon. Instead, I said it means the person who manages your allocation might be replaced by someone who answers to family first. He listened. He didn't look away. That is the most dangerous thing about Arthur. He listens like someone who knows how to value listening. He asked one question that made my chest flip. "What would you do differently?" I explained briefly the kinds of small habits that keep trustees asleep at night, returning calls at odd hours, sending memos before dawn, the personal touches that make institutional capital sticky. I didn't offer playbooks. I offered competence as visible practice. He nodded and poured more scotch into his glass. When he finally said the words I knew he might, it was with the precise weight of a bell in its frame. "If you were a manager for my account, I'd want to know you were in a place that valued judgment over dynasty." That is not a sentence that automatically moves money. It is a sentence that suggests willingness to move money if the framing fits. It was my job to be the frame. "Will you move with me if it looks right?" he asked. "Arthur," I said slowly, "I only ever ask clients to trust me when I can offer them clarity. There will be a chance to look at it with the right documentation and the right team in place. If the optics are right, I will help you build the bridge." He considered. Lunch is a small moment, but I like small moments. We both knew the weight of that sentence. He finished his scotch. The waiter cleared plates. The city outside the window continued to careen in its own business rhythms. The lunch concluded like a prologue. When I left the restaurant, Marcus called. "You've got a firm offer in your inbox," he said, "and legal has been prepped on our side. They'll throw whatever's needed at them, ethically." That last clause was a piece of theater. Ethically meant we'll make sure the moves look professional and not criminal. There are moments in a long career that feel like the second before a wave breaks. Standing on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, I felt the hush before the sound. I had set dominoes in motion, a quiet professional announcement, a private call, an investor lunch. I had not once touched their servers. I had not leaked spreadsheets. I had used the only thing that companies are always complaining can't be measured: relationships, reputation, and the hairline cracks that nepotism builds into organizations. On my way back, I checked my messages. There were polite professional questions from institutional clients, some confused emails from Optima mid-level managers, and an escalation in tone from Gerald that now included the phrase, "We reserve all rights." Language like that is intended to scare. It rarely does if you have counsel, and if you make moves that are defensible. Back at the apartment, I poured a glass of something red and sat by the window with the city at my feet. Chloe had texted earlier asking if she could come over. I said yes. Nobody should be alone in the face of a boss firing you for being too competent. We are not designed to be small in silence. Chloe arrived with a sandwich from the deli downstairs and a notebook full of notes from the call she'd fielded. Her eyes had a near-vertical worry in them. I could see fear had been a recent bedfellow. I offered her the chess-like arrangement of practical help I reserve for people who are not collateral but rather future colleagues. I gave her 2 referrals, a bullet point on how to frame her exit interview, and the promise that she could apply for something on Apex's team and I would put her in front of the right person. "Why did they do it?" she asked, biting into the sandwich. I shrugged. "Because competence can be inconvenient where loyalty to family is a policy." She looked at me like she wanted to punch the nearest wall, and I wanted to tell her that at least there would be a way forward. I also wanted to tell her that something in the marketplace would correct the error, and that was the secret of what I had planned. Markets are terrible at morality but very efficient at reallocating resources when competence shifts. Sometimes the right nudge, a manager moving to a competitor with the right client relationships in tow, is all it takes to start the correction. That evening, Optima issued another statement. "We remain committed to our clients and will continue to serve them." They sent it at 7:14 p.m. Text blasted to stakeholders, made into a press release that read like a prayer for stability. I read it and thought of a house with new wallpaper, hoping to convince onlookers nothing else changed. The post I had made at 10 a.m. had sent an almost immediate flurry of curiosity. By 9 that night, several asset managers had pinged Apex about what the movement might imply. Arthur had not decided yet, Men like him like to move slowly when moving is wise, and quickly when opportunity knocks loudly. His lunch had been the start. Now we needed a tidy next act. That night I didn't sleep much. I thought of Preston's voice saying, "difficult to manage," and how little that phrase explained what I had done. I thought of Chloe and the juniors who hold the structure up with the muscle of late nights and extra weekends. I thought, not for the first time, about the ethical tightrope I had been walking. There is always collateral in a market correction. The icing for me came from two small things. First, that I had no desire to destroy people. Second, that I had thought ahead for the collateral. I had reached out to the HR managers at Apex about making places for displaced staff. I had also committed to making sure Chloe had the chance to interview on the new team. Those were small human acts that softened what could have been brutality. At the end of the night, a final email landed from Gerald. It was more aggressive in tenor now, a reminder of contractual obligations and confidentiality. There was a hint of a cease and desist in the tone. I let it live in my inbox as if it were a curious insect trapped in a jar. It was theater, not substance. But theater can influence boards and trustees who prefer calm to chaos. I went to bed thinking about timing. 3 hours can feel like an eternity when you are waiting for a domino to fall. The kind of dominoes I push are social. A named manager moves, an investor worries, a board asks questions, and a stock price reflects the aggregated anxiety of participants. I had started the sequence. The next day, there would be voices on the phone and people asking uncomfortable questions on letterhead. I was ready to answer some, and to let others quietly decide for themselves. If you're enjoying the smell of corporate arson from the safe distance of narrative, and by all means if you like corporate revenge done right, subscribe. After that small, obnoxious pitch, I left the apartment at dawn the next morning with my phone in my pocket. The world smelled faintly like rain and unmade plans. I had a formal offer in my inbox. Marcus had lined up legal counsel. Arthur had agreed to a follow-up call. The next steps were procedural, public, and full of potential theater. Optima would react. Preston would be exposed in the way that men who can't carry weight are exposed, with cracking sentences and panicked emails. At 8:58 a.m., I hit send on a message to a handful of trustees I'd worked with over the years.
It was quiet, framed as courtesy. If you have questions ahead of the call today, I'm available to answer. The message was not a provocation. It was a light in a window. People looking for the right place to anchor their judgment will often choose the light that offers the clearest view. At 9 a.m., the market tickers did not yet reflect anything. At 9:14, a call from Sterling's office came. "I'll make the call at 9 p.m. tonight." That was a bell. If he said yes, the telephone lines of influence would reorient. Boards would begin to make notes. Institutional allocators would call one another to confirm whether the move was material. I walked into the morning as if into a performance where I had harmonized every instrument. Not perfectly, but well enough. My phone buzzed with the kind of messages that make clear the ropes of power. Is this real? What does this mean for my exposure? Can I move my allocation? Those are the questions that make the market breathe. By 10 a.m., when I was in a small conference room at Apex signing a piece of paper that would make my new title formal, I felt the small human truth I always feel before a wave. The world is made of people who prefer the easy explanation. Nepotism is an easy explanation. Competence is messy and requires attention. I had always loved attention. I would either convert the attention into stewardship or let it dissipate into noise. Gerald, in the meantime, continued to perform his part. He called our counsel with a particular sheen of righteous possession. His emails multiplied like nervous birds. Preston sent out carefully curated messages designed to make it look like continuity, not collapse. Richard was on camera, saying all the words leaders learn in crisis management class. They had learned their lines. The question now was whether the audience, the investors, the trustees, the market, would accept the performance. Audiences can smell when the set is hollow. At noon, I sat in the Apex lobby watching an employee in a suit drill the new offer into my briefcase. There is power in being on the other side of the table, in being the person who now has the capacity to say, "I accept," and mean it. I thought of the kids in the office who had idolized me, and the juniors who trusted me with their futures. I thought of Chloe, who was waiting for an intro. I felt the small weight of responsibility, which is the honest kind of weight to carry. I did not feel vindictive. I felt corrected. There is a difference. Vindictiveness exults in harm. Correction aims to reset metrics so that competence and stewardship matter again. What I had set in motion was unlikely to conclude in a single blow. It would be messy. There would be legal posturing and press. There would be collateral questions about staff. There would be a board that had to decide whether to hold on to its narrative or accept that it had been managed into complacency. At 12:25 p.m.
As I checked my watch on my way to the lobby for Sterling's follow-up call, a message came through from an anonymous fund chatter.
Vanguard is watching. Those words have an electrical quality. Vanguard watches, and the market checks its pulse. If Vanguard flinches, everyone looks up to see why. The phone in my hand felt heavier than it should have. I tucked it into my pocket, steadied my breath, and prepared to make a call that would tilt allocation. I had lit the match the night before with a post and a lunch, small human acts, and now the winged might take it. I walked into the stairwell where reception couldn't overhear and dialed the number. The line connected, and for a second I thought about how comic it was that a woman who had spent 10 years making sure meetings happened was now using the meetings themselves as the instrument of a market correction. The voice on the other end was Arthur's assistant, measured and crisp. I told her I was ready. Then something almost domestic happened. Chloe called. She asked in a voice that had been holding itself like a brittle bird whether I could sit with her while she called HR. I promised I would not be indifferent to the collateral of my choices. That was the line I refused to cross. We were minutes away from a phone call that could set in motion an investor reallocation, that could test whether Optimus brand was a thing of tissue or steel. I felt the pressure, not of revenge, but of stewardship. If I was going to push this correction, I wanted to make sure it healed something and didn't simply make people suffer. I pressed the green button and let the world decide whether the market would be an arbiter of competence or a theater of avoidance. I waited with my thumb on the phone like someone holding a lit match. Arthur's assistant was efficient in the way people who manage other people's time must be. He'll take a call at 9, she said. The words landed like a bell. 9 was the hinge. If Arthur spoke and said yes, trustees would adjust their calendars, allocators would pick up the phone, and a cascade that began with people, not spreadsheets, would begin. I hung up and breathed, the sound shallow and steady. The scene around me, the Apex conference room with its tall windows and a plant in a pot that had never known drought, felt too quiet for the storm I had coaxed into motion. Marcus leaned back in his chair, eyes skimming a feed of messages that I couldn't see. Sarah, the general counsel, had the soft, even expression of someone who had spent her life turning threats into manageable processes. She'd already briefed her teams on how not to be theatrical while being maximally prepared. How long until we look dramatic? Marcus asked, half-smile, the kind that admitted he liked theater as long as it served spreadsheets. Long enough that the optics feel earned, I said, not staged, just inevitable. He nodded. He liked inevitability. It made reporting easier.
By 2 p.m., the ripple had become a visible current. Friends in the industry texted in code. Heard anything? Are you okay? Is this moving? Institutional desks pinged our trading floor to ask, delicately, whether Apex was positioned to receive flows should certain clients want to move. Those were the kinds of questions that happened behind secure lines, not because anything illegal was happening, but because capital is a social arrangement, and people want the reassurance of a place to put it that appears stable. Arthur called at 9 p.m. He didn't preface. He started with a line that made it clear he had assessed more than numbers. Dana, he said, voice clipped and matter-of-fact, I've looked at this, and if the timing is clean and the team is in place, I'd like to reallocate $80 million to a manager I believe will steward it competently. $80 million. The figure landed with a physical heft. I felt it press into the small hollow behind my sternum. It wasn't a guarantee. It was instead the clearest possible signal from someone whose moves other allocators watch. Arthur, I said slowly, that's a meaningful step. It will require documentation and a transitioning plan, and a public signal that trustees will accept. I know, he answered. Will you lead the conversation? I agreed. I didn't promise anything I couldn't deliver, and I didn't gloat at the possibility. Gloating looks petty when the stakes are other people's livelihoods. Instead, I started making calls that were fully procedural and entirely strategic. Sarah on legal framing, Marcus on client communications, a discreet message to my contact at the custodian who could facilitate the mechanics if Arthur signed. It is important to be precise about what happened next, because the claim the headline makes, that I stole their funding, is more dramaturgy than dictionary. I did not forge signatures or embezzle accounts. I changed the direction of faith. I convinced a trusted allocator that a better possibility existed. In doing so, I set in motion a voluntary movement of capital away from an institution that had begun to look fragile. That is a different thing from theft. It's persuasion harnessed to a market that prizes visible stewardship. What I did was social engineering of the highest order, the legitimate kind. I made pathways plausible where they had not been obvious. I made the case that if Optima could not demonstrate steady governance, trustees should consider alternatives. And trustees, when they smell risk, whether defensible or merely presentational, act to preserve their beneficiaries' capital. By midnight, there were already murmurs at Optima. Preston had started sending off panicked, stylized emails to anyone with a title that could be made to look like leadership. Richard was on the phone with the board, voice tight. I could hear the way his sentences began to splinter when he spoke to his marketing teams. He tried to produce a cadence that used the words confidence, continuity, and leader in equal measure. Those words, when thin, have the unfortunate quality of making the signal-to-noise ratio worse. Optima's press statement, already drafted, landed at 3 in the morning in newsrooms. It promised continuity and process,
and included a sentence about long-term strategy that had the mild consolation of a warmed-over corporate promise. People read it and saw a house repainting itself. But markets are not swayed by full sentences. They are swayed by the absence of a person in a room who has been reliably clearing small frictions for years. When those frictions go unresolved, people notice. Trustees notice. Allocators notice. The social fabric that keeps money where it is began to thread toward a new location, me at Apex. The next morning, the board meeting at Optima became a crucible. I watched from my new desk at Apex, a modest cluster of monitors, a plant under glass, the small ceremony of a security badge that meant I could make coffee in a different building now, as the stock tickers began to twitch. Sarah had set up a war room. She and Marcus and I watched the feeds and kept a list of every institutional question that filtered through to our desk. We answered where necessary and took notes where reputational risk required a file. At 10 a.m., Gerald sent an escalatory layer with the kind of lawyerly flourish meant more to intimidate shareholders than to create an immediate legal barrier. He referenced contractual obligations and potential equitable relief. He used phrases like material breach. The letter was long on theatricality and short on enforceability. It was the kind of instrument designed to create pause, which sometimes is enough to hold capital in place. Sarah read it, set it down, and said, "We prepare responses. We make sure our steps are defensible. That letter won't stop a trustee from making a sound fiduciary decision." I admired her calm. Legal theater is a real thing, but it rarely wins a popularity contest in the boardroom when the evidence of managerial incompetence is visible in who answers phones and who doesn't. At 2 p.m., a mid-sized institutional fund called our desk worried that their exposure may be compromised. We gave them the facts, not theatrics, and a path to diligence. That diligence was what investors needed, evidence that funds would be stewarded well if moved. We provided it in the form of a team, a plan, and the reality that a manager who stayed calm in a storm tended to be better at keeping a boat upright. The critical move came at the public investor call Optima had scheduled for the next day. That call, the one investors always circle in red, was to be their stage of authority, their opportunity to reassure the market that competence still sat in the chair.
I understood the performative stakes. A confident voice in an auditorium of stakeholders can reset narratives. What I suspected, and what everyone else suspected by the time the call began, was that Optima lacked the people who could credibly speak with authority. Preston, in particular, had been given tasks beyond his capacity. His sentences had always ended with a search for approval. Leadership by virtue of a last name is fragile in the light of pointed questions. The morning of the call, I woke earlier than usual. I'd slept in fits. My chest felt stretched like an overused muscle. I made coffee black and walked around Apex's trading floor, watching people do what they do: monitor flows, keep a disciplined face, speak in the language of risk and mitigation. There was a humility to their competence that I liked. Competence makes modest demands: email discipline, follow-through, the small courtesies that keep trustees asleep. By 9 a.m., the Optima dial-in began. The company's PR person started with the kind of practiced calm you hear when an organization is trying to manufacture cool. The CEO, Richard, whose voice I had heard a dozen times in more graceful settings, opened with a set of words designed to reassure. He promised transparency, a new committee, a renewed focus on client stewardship. And then a trustee who had been on my list and had opted to attend asked a simple question. How will Optima ensure that future assignment of accounts is based on client need rather than internal favors? You can tell how a leader will weather a storm by how they answer that first unavoidable question. Words matter. Authority is not performance. It is currency traded on the market of trust. Richard's answer began rehearsed and then frayed. His sentences moved from defense to deflection. He used the passive voice. He said things like, "We are reviewing," and "We're committed," and "We will take steps." Those are the phrases that sound authoritative only when backed by credible signals of action, like human beings who have the respect of trustees. Preston tried to interject with a line about continued focus and operational realignment. He sounded like someone reading from a call sheet. His voice lacked the rhetorical density to hold the room. He used buzzwords that, in the moment when facts matter, duct-taped the edges of his sentences rather than sealing them. Then one of the institutional investors spoke, a man who had no time for corporate theater. He asked about specific decision-making processes and whether the company had independent oversight for key client assignments. He wanted examples of how Optima had handled conflicts of interest historically and what formal steps had been taken to prevent favoritism. The next 90 seconds felt like a long slide down a narrow chute. Richard started to slow, his sentences losing cadence. He promised investigations and third-party reviews. He tried to reassure that lines of accountability were clear. From my vantage, watching the call in a small conference room with Sarah and Marcus, it was like seeing a bridge whose suspension cables were being questioned in real time.
The bridge doesn't fall because of one question, it falls because people's faith that it will hold has been rattled. The market reacts faster than the PR team. A few large allocators who were watching, not publicly but with private calls in motion, began to move into their procedures. Their trading desks began to ask for settlement instructions in case a board approved a reallocation. These were conservative actions taken in private. They were not headlines yet, but they signaled a devout caution among those who had the power to reassign capital. At 11:37 a.m., an independent director sent an email to the board with 3 words: "We require clarity." That email functioned as a lever. Boards do not like ambiguity. Trustees do not like fear. When those 2 groups unite in the same direction, institutions shift. By noon, Optima stock, which had been steady in a narrow range, started to gap, not smashingly, not impossibly. The kind of steady professional reallocation that institutions do quietly shows up as a downward trend that, if aggregated by enough desks and custodians, looks like a correction. People who watch tickers professionally began to tweet cautiously about leadership concerns at Optima. The noise became a proxy for confidence. Preston's headspace, from what I gleaned through public statements and a few feeds, narrowed into a tight, panicked focus. He called in for a series of interviews with the company's communications team and began to send out messages trying to assert continuity. That is a losing move when trust must be demonstrated by competence, not asserted by repetition. At 2:45 p.m., I received a note from Arthur's office. Transfers would begin pending documentation. It was careful and discreet. Sarah and our custodian had prepared a clean path. The bank would require forms and time, and the transition would be executed under all appropriate compliance procedures. It was business, not melodrama. But in the markets, business can create collapses. A migration of 80 million is not a cultural event, it's a reallocation. It is a fact that justifies further action by other institutional players who prefer to be with the crowd. In the hours that followed, a cascade of confirmations came in small private increments. One trustee called a peer and asked, "Are you watching Optima?" A peer called back, "Yes, we're speaking to our counsel." Counsel, predictably, counsel. When counsel says watch, trustees often act. Optima's quarterly call, which began with a confident cadence, dissolved into a sequence of defensive propositions. Richard made promises he could not immediately make good on.
The board convened an emergency meeting and did something they do rarely. They asked for the CEO's resignation as a way to re-anchor confidence. That is a clinical way of regaining trust. Remove the person whose appointment created the perception of risk and show the market the surgery has a clean set of hands to complete the operation. Richard tried to hold, but the weight of his decisions, notably the promotion of his son to a role that required hard judgment under pressure, became the pattern everyone saw. When a leader chooses loyalty to lineage over the measurement of outcomes, the market often treats that as a material governance issue. Preston's humiliation came publicly, as humiliations destined to be watched do. He spoke to a small press contingent outside the boardroom, attempting to assert control, but the sentences came out hollow. They were not maliciously cruel, they were simply inadequate. It is the cruelty of capitalism that inadequate sentences get amplified into loss. He apologized in a way that implied he had been surprised by criticism rather than having been accountable to it. The board asked for and received Richard's resignation later that afternoon. The company appointed an interim lead with a background steeped in fiduciary practice and structural risk. The signal was clear. A new person would now speak with a different cadence. That change was the market's currency of remedy. I watched the entire arc with an odd mixture of detachment and heavy relief. I had not engineered a technical attack. I had shifted trust, nudged it into a new channel, and let institutional practices do the rest. What felt most satisfying in that moment was not the pleasure of seeing someone pilloried, it was the reassertion that competence mattered, that stewardship could regain its place as the deciding factor in where money rests. But the aftermath was not a neat victory. Collateral damage was real. Chloe, who had been patient and brave, suddenly found herself in an awkward limbo. Some of the junior staff at Optima, whose names have not been mentioned in any of the headlines, were now searching for internal memos to understand whether they were retained. I spent a long hour on the phone that evening with Chloe, walking her through next steps, offering introductions, and listening to her cry when she needed it. She was not collateral in my mind. She was one of the reasons I had refused to let the correction be cruel. I made good on more than promises. Over the following days, Apex created a small transitional fund to evaluate and hire affected talent from Optima who had been unfairly exposed by the leadership change. We hired 2 junior analysts and offered another role in our operations team. It was not an act of magnanimity so much as pragmatic reconstruction. Skilled people need places that value skill. We had the capacity and the conscience to offer it. Gerald, predictably, continued his theater. He filed a terse letter alleging possible breaches and suggested litigation as a recourse. We had anticipated such moves. Sarah's team prepared responses that were crisp and professional. Legal suits can take years and often hinge on narrow technicalities. They are rarely an immediate barrier to market reallocation when trustees have judged governance wanting.
There were press profiles that tried to paint me as villain or heroine, depending on the outlet's appetite for a spectacle. I accepted the coverage as the cost of having shifted a narrative. One of the hardest parts was the small human scenes that did not fit neatly into a drama about corporate collapse. A receptionist at Optima, who had always remembered my coffee order and the names of my kids at charity events, sent me a message asking whether she would still have work. I forwarded her contact to HR at Apex, asking them to consider transferring certain administrative roles that are often the first to be lost in reorganizations. I bought Chloe a plane ticket so she could interview for a role in our operations team without worrying about the immediate cost. These things didn't undo the stress Optima staff had endured, but they were small goods in a messy moral ledger. In the weeks that followed, Optima's board moved quickly to stabilize the company. They appointed a permanent CEO with a background in governance and compliance, and they instituted oversight committees that, if they did nothing else, made a show of intent. Markets rewarded the action with some stabilization, but the social proof had been broken. The idea that the company would quietly reassert the old order without addressing the root causes was gone. Nepotism, once visible, is corrosive. When governance demanded a new standard, the market responded. A year later, I would sometimes wake with a start and think about the moment Preston had said, "You're difficult to manage." That phrase became a motif in my head, an emblem of how organizations silence inconvenient competence. I read it now, in hindsight, as shorthand for the larger failure. A system that privileges appearance and lineage over competence and stewardship. My actions were not a crusade against family. They were a corrective to the mechanics of governance that left clients exposed. At Apex, my title was public, my responsibilities real. I inherited client lists and sleepless afternoons. The office tasted like coffee and the quiet hum of responsible people doing the daily labor of stewardship. I liked the rhythm. There was a moral clarity to the work. If you promised good stewardship, you practiced it. If you failed, you owned it and made reparations. That ethic suited me. But I did not and will not pretend that everything was healed. There were lawsuits, eventually.
There were board meetings and investigations and the murky work of corporate insurance. There were staff who, despite our efforts, chose to leave the industry entirely because the reputational scarring had been too much. Those were losses I carried. The joy I felt was tempered by the knowledge that corrections cost people in all sorts of small ways. Sometimes, in the quiet hours after a long day, I would pour a glass of something with the color of autumn and sit at my window looking at a city that had continued to be indifferent to individual dramas. The clack-clack of a dishwasher and an apartment across the way, the hum of a bus, the steady breathing of a city that has learned how to carry 1,000 small disappointments. I'd think of Preston, who had been given a role he could not carry, and of Richard, who had been too used to the leveraging power of a name to see the rot beneath his hands. I'd think of Chloe and the juniors who deserved better. I'd think about the moral calculus of correction, how to make institutions answer for choices without wanting to ruin people for the sake of spectacle. Once, a friend asked me over dinner whether I felt guilty. "You collapsed a company," he said with a disagreeable sort of curiosity. "Even if it needed changing, do you sleep at night?" I looked at my glass and considered the city in the window. "Guilt hangs like an old coat," I said. "You can wear it until it weighs you down, or you can put it aside and do the work that fixes whatever you broke." I did my best to put band-aids where they were needed and to make sure competent people had a place to land. That doesn't absolve me of every discomfort, but it makes the story less monstrous. That answer satisfied him. The truth is more complicated. I did what I thought the fiduciary duty required of me as someone who had been entrusted with relationships. I didn't leverage illegal methods. I leveraged persuasion, evidence, and the simple human fact that trust moves when credible hands move. I didn't set out to break lives. I set out to correct an installation that risked harming clients. Sometimes repair requires force. Sometimes a market acts as the blunt instrument of accountability. Months later, at a conference where I was modestly introduced as the manager who moved, an audience member asked me whether I regretted not simply staying and fighting from within. "Wouldn't reform from inside be better?" he asked. I thought about every small call I had made that morning, the minutes of access, the network of relationships, the juniors who had relied on me. "Sometimes reform from inside is noble," I said, "but noble can fail when the system prefers comfort over competence." I weighed the chances and chose the path that protected clients and gave people who deserved to be stewarded a place to land. He nodded. He probably wanted a story with a simple hero. Real stories are messier.
When people read the headline, "They fired me for not fitting in, so I stole their funding and collapsed the CEO's empire," they imagine a cinematic caper. They imagine a protagonist with black gloves and a dramatic soundtrack.
The reality was quieter, grayer, and more human. I was not a thief in a trench coat. I was a manager who had spent a lifetime becoming the person clients trusted in the margins. When forced out, I exercised the one lever that still matters in finance, the voluntary act of trust. If there is a lesson I would offer, not as a manual but as a reflection, it is this. Institutions are brittle when they confuse loyalty with competence. Markets do not judge intentions alone, they judge outcomes and the perception of stewardship. Correction is messy and it creates collateral hurt. That is why empathy matters. That is why we must rehouse talented juniors and treat people with dignity when structures fail. In the months after Optima's reorganization, our team at Apex worked to place several displaced employees into roles where they could continue their careers. Chloe moved into an operational manager role that suited the meticulous way she worked. She would later tell me, at a small celebration when she passed a certification she had been studying for, that the move had felt like a rescue. "You didn't save my job," she said, filling the sentence with gratitude that made my chest ache with the right kind of warmth. "You offered me a path." That will do, I thought. That will do. On good nights, I think of the day I sat in my apartment with thin coffee in my mug and a calendar that felt like a map of my life. On better nights, I remember Arthur Scotchneed, the way he listened, the small rituals that make trust tangible. On worse nights, I see the faces of the people who lost work despite our best efforts and wish I could unmake the part of the story that hurt them. Power is an instrument that can be wielded to build or to break. What I did was to redirect power away from a structure that had calcified into preference for a single family rather than for the people who deserved to steward institutional capital. The result was chaos in the short term, and I would argue a better alignment in the medium term. Whether that justifies everything is a question I return to often. A few years later, someone introduced me at a panel as the woman who brought stewardship back to the market. I smiled and corrected the hyperbole. I had not bought anything. I had leveraged trust and the prudence of trustees. I had, with a team around me, created an environment where people who did their jobs well could keep doing them. The corporate world is full of stories where competence is punished because it disturbs the comfortable hierarchy.
Mine ends not with blood on the floor, but with repositioning. A CEO who resigned, a son who learned a brutal lesson about capacity, a group of juniors given a lifeline, and capital reallocated to a manager whose practice prioritized clients over cliques. We did not collapse a civilization. We corrected a misallocation. The market did the rest. In the end, I like to think of it as a recalibration. An institution that had become complacent was nudged into accountability. That feels less like arson and more like necessary medicine. Bitter, perhaps, but sometimes life-saving. There is a small private ritual I still practice when I am tempted to feel triumphant. I call Chloe, or one of the other juniors we hired, and ask how they're doing. I schedule time to mentor, to ensure we are not simply poaching competence, but actually nurturing it. If vengeance was ever a motive, it was only a momentary impulse, quickly replaced by the steadier aim of stewardship. Sometimes people ask whether I would do it again. That question is not rhetorical. I answer honestly. I would act when fiduciary duty demanded action and when the evidence suggested institutional failure. I would not seek spectacle. I would minimize collateral harm. I would try, as always, to protect the juniors. In a way, the story is simple. They fired me for not fitting into their story, and I decided to write a different one where competence mattered. I did not burn a house down to teach it a lesson. I opened a door and let the market judge which house had the soundest foundation. If you want to hear more stories where people who think they're untouchable find that the world has other ways of telling the truth, subscribe.